What's going on, guys? Cast to Podcast. Ronnie Moore here with my man Kyle Jessie. Episode 28 of the podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, welcome into the show. We're going to talk a little bit of Rapala Bassmaster Fantasy Fishing, a little preview for Lake Fork, which is the fifth stop of the Bassmaster Elite Series season. And Kyle, it's kind of gone quick. We've had basically every Elite Series event with about a week or 10 days in between them. So we've kind of knocked out the first half of the season much sooner than we did last year with the COVID season. We didn't have halfway point of the season until August of last year, and it's late April, and we're over halfway through once Lake Fork is done. But we've blown through a lot, but it's been some really dramatic events through the first four events, weather-wise, storylines-wise, and the way the winning day went for those anglers. So it's been a great 2021 season so far.
Yeah, definitely has. And like you said, it has been a polar opposite as of last year. Having the Eufaula event and being the second event in the season, and it's in June. And then this year, hearing people say reaching the halfway point of the season, it's like head scratching because I'm like, I feel like this is going by so fast comparatively to last year, especially.
We were talking about it, and from June of last year when we did Lake Eufaula for the second event of the season to now, or basically let's just say to the end of July, we'll just do a 13-month window. We would have had 17 of 18 possible elites in a 13-month span. So that is 17 elites in 13 months with about a month and a half or 2 months of an off season. You've got then 17 elites in 11 months. And so they're definitely knocking them down, and the storylines never change. I mean, they're always changing, but it's refreshing to see some of the crazy things. The Sabine River, we talked about that in our last episode. If you haven't watched that, I'll pop it up right here that you can click on and watch it if you want after this video. But the Sabine was dramatic. Long runs, close weights, two guys running away with it after the first 2 days, and then it really got tight on the weekend with some guys making some charges near the takeoff. And fantasy fishing didn't disappoint either. We saw some big fish take the top spot there and whatnot, but you jumped ahead in fantasy fishing. And so I'm going to let you break the ice for Lake Fork Rapala Bassmaster Fantasy Fishing. And I'm going to let you give your picks first. We'll start out with bucket A because I need to take notes on if I need to change my team up. And that 2 minutes of you explaining will do that for me.
Yeah. So in bucket A, something we've talked about all season is the fact that no matter what event it is, that Greg Hackney is going to be the leading, he's going to have the highest player percentage of anybody. Well, for the first time all season, he doesn't in bucket A, which I found fascinating. I guess I don't necessarily think people are jumping off board. I mean, I think, people realize Greg Hackney is going to be a force all season long, but he's missed back-to-back cuts in two events that he, you would think he would be really, really competitive in.
Places he's won at.
Yeah, I mean, I genuinely think that if you want to see somebody that's ticked off and gonna catch them, and the first fish that bites his I'd imagine jig or something of that nature at Lake Fork's gonna feel his wrath. And I don't know, I feel like he's gonna come back. And this event, I mean, so many fish are gonna be shallow, probably gonna be a handful of ways to catch them shallow. You give Greg Hackney options like that, and he's going to figure it out. So I actually went with Hackney in bucket A.
Which
like I said,
your third time this season?
Second or third, yeah.
Yeah. At St. John's, you might have picked him, and then
I did not at St. John's. I had Canterbury in bucket A.
Oh, okay.
So only the second time.
Yeah, and it's just there's been so many pundits pick him and whatnot. And so, for my pick, it's going to sound very familiar because I am zigging while people are zagging. Like you said, first four events, he is not only the highest in bucket A, but he's top two no matter where we've been overall with the percentage, of players selecting him. And with him being 10% chosen, and he's in bucket A at Lake Fork, very shocking to me. The other guys in that bucket that are highly picked, Seth Fighter, Lee Livesey, obviously living there. Steve Kennedy's picked really low as well. He's a good pick. It may be an option to pick there. He's had a birthday this week as well. Had a pretty good a couple event stretch there, and that's why he's in bucket A. That's the hard thing to read. first event of the season, second event of the season, those are very small sample sizes on why they're in the high buckets like they are. But with 4 events under our belt, the guys who are in bucket A, top 20 in points, have caught them in at least 3 or 4 of the events to a certain extent. Hackney's 2 missed cuts were preceded by 2 top 10 finishes. So that's the kind of offsetting thing there. He may have only gotten check in 2 of the events, but they were the best checks you can almost get without getting a win. So Hackney has been a great pick. So I think that, yeah, I like that pick a lot because I picked him as well. Greg Hackney is my bucket A pick. Zigging and zagging with our fantasy fishing players because highly picked and gets second. Highly picked gets 6th or 7th. Highly picked misses the cut. Highly picked misses the cut. People jump off the bandwagon a little bit and kind of explore. They're like, oh, Lee Livesey got a top 10 at the Sabine. Now he's going to his home lake. I'm going to pick him. Stetson Blaylock guided. Or Stetson's in another bucket, but he's another guy who'll be picked a lot. Seth Fighter's done well. He's coming off a top 10. Let's pick those guys. And Greg Hackney's at 10%. This is the only time he's going to be a steal all year, other than maybe smallmouth plays. So I'm going in with Hackney as well, surprisingly. But he's just very affordable for the percentage right there. And I think we talk about the percentage debate. I honestly, I'm not going to put money on it, but I bet Greg Hackney will catch a 10-pounder at Lake Fork. I mean, there's nothing that's happening at Lake Fork that tells me he's not going to catch them. That's the
right.
thing. The Sabine, there's so many factors. Lake Fork, he could pick up on any random stretch and flip his jig or sight fish or wind a square bill or something. Swim jig, topwater. I mean, this is a Greg Hackney lake, and I think
no doubt.
I think that April is a deadly month for him. The Sabine's just a crazy fisher. You can't chalk that up to momentum or anything. It's just hard to make the right decision there.
No doubt. And that's, you look back at the day one of that event. I mean, losing that big fish.
One of the biggest.
I mean, that's the difference. Yeah, absolutely. That's the difference in, him finishing 52nd or 3rd or wherever he just finished just outside the cut to finishing in like the 20s. I mean, like 30s maybe. Like,
yeah, that have propelled him.
Literally, like that big of a swing. And like you said, I mean, for him to be picked that low in bucket A, not just in any old tournament, but like you said, in a tournament where all of his like biggest strengths are going to be in play like 100%. I mean, you couldn't imagine a tournament setting up better for him. And here we are saying this. I don't know how many times you could say this to this point in the season, because you could almost say it for every event. But I mean, it's really true. I mean, like really, really is the truth. So, I mean, like you said, kind of a steal at 10%. And I felt like that was a no-brainer to have to pick him.
What was the quote you said? I know what it was, but I want you to say it again, what Greg Hackney said about the schedule and the lakes, that when someone asked him about it's setting up good for him.
Oh, yeah. So something I'd heard him quote, if somebody asked him, he's like, oh, this tournament really sets up for your style and the way you like to fish. And he said, I feel like they pretty much all do at this point in my career. Like, I don't go anywhere and feel like I don't know what I'm doing. He's like, basically to the extent that he never feels like it's not his strength. But I mean, from an outsider's perspective, knowing what he does best, and I mean, he also knows what he does best. This is it. Like, this tournament is it. So, I mean, I feel like it's kind of a no-brainer with that low percentage.
Yeah, I was actually, when I logged on to Bassmasterfantasy.com and set my team up, I was like, 10%? I was like, did I click the wrong event? Are we looking at Neely?
Yeah, right.
I was like, what tournament are we looking at? And I was like, ain't no chance. I was like, I got to put him on my team. And I like picking favorites. Most of the time, I stray away and I do some obscure, name or low percentage. But some of these guys have a reputation of being a great big fish hunter. Steve Kennedy has that reputation. He's lowly picked in that bucket. I'm surprised. But I won't pick a Steve Kennedy because I know how when his highs are as high as they can be, but sometimes his lows are as low as they can be. And
sure.
So it's hard to get consistency out of him. But for Greg Hackney, I think, like you said, he's not had 2 bad finishes. They're like the first
barely outside of the cut. Yeah.
So it's not like he's got a chip on his shoulder, but he's going to catch a 10-pounder at Fork, no doubt. I think he's going to hold up a fish on stage, which is over 24 inches, at least 2 times this week. And I wouldn't be surprised. We've seen him, a couple of his wins, Sam Rayburn in the first week of the Elite Series, flipping bushes. You've seen him at Texoma in this very event just up the road from Fork, flipping bushes and trees. Not saying there's a bunch of trees in the water, but the fish are up as tight as they can be to him probably. And so I'm looking for,
That's
and it's a big fish weight. Like we see St. John's, he always is top 10 there, and it's always 80 plus pounds or something. He just shows up when the big ones are up shallow, ready to bite.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, that's something I've been thinking a lot about too, is the fact that, like you mentioned earlier, with sight fishing, he's historically a really good sight fisherman. With that being said, I could easily see a lot of times what happens in these sight fishing events is by the time day 3, sometimes even day 2 rolls around, you just kind of run out of sight fish. Fish that you have located, marked in practice. You can mark a bunch, but then you go back and they're either off the bed, somebody's already caught them, they're really spooky a certain day. His style, I think that he could do that, but then if that like falters off, like you said, he's just the kind of fisherman that can just take off down the bank,
Yeah.
and he'll outcatch some of the guys that have it really like in their heads dialed in. Like he's just that good of a shallow water fisherman, and that's just who Greg Hackney is. So I mean, like we'd said, for him to only be at 10%, I mean, it's like kind of a no-brainer.
Welcome into the Cast a Podcast where Kyle, Jessie, and Ronnie Moore only talk about Greg Hackney. We talked about him a bunch last time,
Yeah.
probably in a negative light, but it was just being honest with the percentages. This week, we are both on the Greg Hackney train for Bucket A Fantasy Fishing. Such an affordable percentage. I don't see, Lee Livesey is great, but I think that it really set up well for him in the fall because it's tougher. He knows how to fish that lake, had a great rise up the leaderboard. And then the last time we were here in the spring, he gambled a little bit and it didn't pay off, and he didn't end up doing as well as he hoped. So who knows? I think a lot of these times certain anglers have an advantage on a lake, and that doesn't mean they have an advantage January to December. They have an advantage July to August. They have an advantage October to December, maybe around the spawn. But when the fish are up shallow, shad spawning season, flipping, it's really hard to have an advantage when they're biting. And that's, unless Fork all of a sudden starts fishing tough, it should be a great event. So jumping over to Bucket B though, we've got a lot of great anglers to select in this one as well. I mentioned Stetson Blaylock prematurely, but he's one who has done a lot of summer guide trips, electronics courses for people over the years at Fork. It's only 3 hours and change from Little Rock in that Benton region where he lives. And then you have the former winner, Brandon Cobb, in that bucket as well. You've got a Buddy Gross, a Ray Hanselman from Texas, Scott Martin. Obviously, we're expecting to see him make a final day and do well soon. He's kind of honestly really performed on day 1 and 2 and really struggled on day 3 in a lot of his events. And he's dropped off and had a 20 to 35 place finish, but it could have been he was on the the precipice of a top 10. So we'll see about that one as well. But I've got my eyes set on Bryan New. I don't know exactly necessarily why, but he loves fishing shallow. He loves fishing deep as well. He's got the electronics game down pat, but he just fishes free. He's got a freeness to his game that we've mentioned Kyle Welcher has, that we've even said sometimes KVD or Aaron Martins has, where they kind of just fish by the seat of their pants and they're not afraid to go and do this, do that. Bryan New's got a little bit of that in him, and he's chomping at the bit to set the hook. He had a tough Sabine. But I think Bryan New, whether it's a white swim jig or a buzzbait, every angler in the field has experience with that. But, man, that is something that some of those North Carolina grinders, they just do. They lock a top water in their hand, maybe go frogging some, maybe flipping, and sight fishing. A lot of the lakes are clear, really good at sight fishing. And so for a Bryan New, if it's not as clear at Fork, still might be able to get around some fish and find them. But and I can see, you never know. Somebody could get on that forward-facing sonar of some post-spawn fish that are suspended or some pre-spawn. You don't know how it's going to go, but I'd expect most of the action to be on the bank, maybe some humps and some knobs, 10, 12 feet of water, possibly. But shallow game-wise, 5.7%. With as many good anglers as I mentioned, taking up some pretty good percentages, 9 to 20% for everybody I mentioned previously. Bryan New still has 5.7%, so it's not like it's a out of the park, a low percentage to choose from. So I think Bryan New is going to turn it around and catch a good couple bags and make the cut at least this week.
I like that pick. I think that's definitely an underrated pick, and and it kind of goes back to, this is a hard thing to like explain and put into words, but what you were talking about earlier, like when the fish are biting, having that local advantage like doesn't necessarily help. It just seems fish are biting. Bryan catching them, like Bryan knew is going to be around them. He's going to be catching them, and he's just like one of those guys that just seems like he figures it out so naturally. Like you said, the Sabine River, obviously it didn't work out that way for him, but you put that many fish up shallow. Yeah, it definitely seems like a tournament Bryan knew could do really well in.
And
Actually, kind of surprised, like you said, it's not as high as he is.
and the Sabine was really the first 2 days of competition that he hasn't caught them in one of those days. The St. John's, we obviously saw him win that event. In Knoxville, had a terrible day one, had one of the best bags on day 2 to jump up. And then Pickwick, we saw him on camera a couple days there, was catching some good smallmouth, in the middle of the middle region of the lake, but he runs around everywhere. And then we saw the Sabine. He didn't make the cut. Tough 2 days of fishing for him. That's really the first 2 lumps that he's had to take in his Elite Series pro other than day 1 Knoxville.
Yeah, no doubt. So as far as my bucket B pick, it's someone you have already talked about in Stetson Blaylock. And if you watched our previous episode talking about our Drain the Lake picks, he was one of my Drain the Lake picks as well. Mercury Bassmaster Drain the Lake. Don't forget to set your rosters for that as well this week.
Anglers
with that,
once you pick an angler, you can't use them again, so pick wisely.
should be fun. I'm looking forward to that. But anyways, went with Stetson Blaylock and bucket B. He is one of the higher percentage guys. As we both agree, I don't typically like doing that. But no matter how the tournament plays out, whether the spawning fish, like the shallow, I think shallow is going to play regardless, but it just depends on what stage of shallow those fish are in. Right. So if that's the deal, and like there's just a lot of fish being caught spawning, like sight fishing or fishing for fish that you can't see but are spawning, I think Stetson Blaylock's super super hard to pick against. And then also something that we've talked about previously is, like you said, Stetson Blaylock has fished Lake Fork a lot in the past. Like you said, used to do classes out there, like sonar classes. Definitely has taken the trip down I-30 to Lake Fork plenty of times. So I think he's the kind of guy that could have some sneaky stuff. Might not be a Texan, like some of the other guys that are super highly percentage picked, but I think either way he could find them in whatever stage they might be in, and I think he would have an advantage.
He's closer than most Texans are. Ray Hansen, yeah. Texas, and he's probably like 12 hours away because he's all the way
no kidding
on the west side of it. But Stetson's last 2 events there, the 2019 one around the first week of May, similar conditions to now, just a week later, and the November event last year to end the season, he's got a 16th and a 9th. So he has by far one of the best, other than maybe a Keith Combs, best percentages or average finishes out of the 2 events, which are 2 dramatically different times of year. But a 16th and a 9th, 12 and a half place average finish. So I like that pick. I didn't want to pick 2 back-to-back like odds-on favorites, and so I see why you did it. And I went a little bit different than my strategy for Drain the Lake. So I admire that. So follow that up. Who do you have in bucket C?
I'm going Drew Benton. So
this bucket C is tough.
Very tough. Bucket C was extremely challenging for me to select. Here's the reality of it. I think that it's going to be day 3 of the tournament, and I'm going to be like so mad at myself, Keith Combs, because it just seems like if there has ever been a more cemented, like locked on, somebody's going to catch them on a certain lake, maybe not necessarily time of the year that he would prefer. Actually, I know for sure it's not the time of the year he wanted the tournament because he told me that in Palatka. But at the same point, how could you argue against Keith Combs in bucket C? So I kind of hate to pick against him, but at the same point, it's like you said, my first 2 picks are pretty high percentage, almost the favorites in their buckets. So I went with Drew Benton in bucket C just because there's 2 guys I naturally think of every time actually there's a handful, but 2 guys that I think of on tour. And it'd be both of Drew Benton and Drew Cook. Both of them back in 2019 had super good finishes. I think Drew Benton finished 9th in 2019, finished in the top 10. If there's fish to be seen and caught, Drew Benton is going to see them and he's going to catch them. It's pretty plain and simple the way I see it. Like I said, the only thing I worry about is just that lasting for a handful of days. But I mean, a guy that is rock solid in tournaments like this, where you're catching sight fish or you're at least fishing for fish that are in some stage of the spawn, Drew Benton is hard to beat. And at 5%, he was one of my lower percentage guys that I went with.
Well, I like that, and I'm going to be burned by Keith Combs as well because he always catches them, but there's that weird feeling of you're like, what if this is the time he doesn't catch them?
Yeah, right.
What if, and you don't want to be stuck with him then, and you're like 41% of fantasy fishing players are picking him, and if he finishes 50th and misses the cut, you get the chance to really, really jump up above him. And so I didn't pick him either, and I'm going to look back at this video and I'm really going to be like, how dumb, because
exactly.
He is the Cliff Prince, if not better, at Fork, like Cliff Prince is at the St. Johns River, to be honest, in all of Texas. Falcon, Amistad, Sam Rayburn, Toledo Bend, Lake Fork. I bet you Keith Combs is probably going to top 20 in any event in Texas almost, other than the Sabine River. And so it's hard not to pick 41.3% Keith Combs, but he's going to catch him. But I think that for the style and time of year, I think Scott Canterbury at 5.7% is a really good selection. I picked him at the beginning of the year and he burned me, and I held a grudge for an event or two, but I'm off that now. No, I didn't really do that, but I was surprised. He had such a good track record at the St. Johns River. With the way the season's gone, I think that Canterbury's kind of figuring out Fork a little bit. It was one of his first times going there the last time the first time we came there in 2019.
Right.
And I think that he's going to have it figured out shallow and be able to do that. So that's my bucket C. Going into bucket D, I'm keeping that kind of train of thought going. Bucket D is really dispersed percentage-wise. No one angler really has it, locked down with a giant percentage. And I'm going Matt Arey, 4.8% selected so far, bucket D. I feel like these fish are in between a shad spawn, in between the actual spawn. There's going to be pre-spawn fish. There's going to be fish that have been spawned for a month. We got some cool temperatures going, so top water might be a factor. And I really feel like Matt Arey is going to be one that if it's not spawn and it's any of the other things and they're in a mix, like you said, you don't want to run out of spawning fish. I feel like he could pick up and go catch fish doing other things. And so I feel like Matt Arey, I didn't pick him because of percentage. I picked him because of style. I think he's a good fit for Fork, even if, he hasn't had necessarily the best performances over his 2 seasons at Fork. But I mean, he's gotten a 19th and a 61st, but his 19th was May, close to the time period we're at now. So take a little bit of that grain of salt. We basically like to twist numbers. If someone got a top 5 at Fork in the fall, man, he really figured that place out. He's going to be a shoe-in now.
Well,
but this guy didn't catch him in the fall. Well, it's totally different. It's the spring, so we'll twist those numbers. But I do think this is much more indicative this time because it's 2 different lakes, 2 different situations, and those anglers were put through the grinder at the end of last year with so many events in the fall.
Yeah, and I think that if you had to say one of the two, like you said, it definitely is what we want it to be. Let's be honest. But at the same point, if you had to compare tournaments to one of the two, we were just talking about this a moment ago. You can't really compare it in November because I mean it's the same lake. Don't get me wrong. I mean there's definitely parallels. I mean if somebody did well there in November, that's great. A feel for the lake, it goes a long way. With that being said, if you were going to go back and look at previous success, the tournament itself will be so much more similar to the one in 2019, obviously, which a handful of my picks, a Drew Benton especially, we're in bucket C, going backwards here for a second. It's like those guys that caught him really well kind of at the tail end of spawn and doing. I think this go around will be even stronger. So it seems like in my head, like if you look at the way that turned out, those guys doing some things that theoretically would only be better pushing it back a couple weeks. But anyways,
well, and you can say, like, some guys have struggled and had bad finishes, and you wonder if that's indicative of how they figure out the lake. But it could be a simple lost 7-pounder and you missed the cut, and it looks like you got 57th because you stunk, but
sure,
cut, because you lost one big bite, So
yeah.
we'll see how that plays out. But like you said, bucket D.
Bucket D, sticking with the trend of somebody that can catch them in a high weight tournament, like a big weight tournament, I'm going Micah Frazier. So granted, back in the 2019 event, had a really good event there, catching them on a top water, schooling fish. I don't think that will play as much this go around. Maybe it does. I don't know. But with that being said, typically anytime like big weights are being thrown around, excluding Florida, I don't know about his history in Florida as much, but Tennessee River tournaments, anytime the weights are big, it seems like Micah Frazier is a player. Also, something that should be said is Micah Frazier's in bucket D. Like that's also not something we're used to seeing. Let's be honest. Like that's surprising to me as it is. Somebody that has been on a downward trend of the last couple of events, so that is a reason some people would pick him less. And trust me, it went through my head. But at the same point, if there was an event for Micah Frazier to bust out of that, I think this is it. A lake that he's obviously had some success in. Like I said, big fish in a time of the year that he's typically really, really good pick. Like I said, I like bucket D for Micah Frazier. 8.5 or 4%. I can live with that. It's not the high, by no means the highest in the bucket, but low enough for me to be cool with, for sure.
Well, I'm going to try to wrap this up real quick with bucket E. And so bucket E, I'm going to jump in and give my pick because you're going to hound me on this one real quick. But I hate picking high percentage anglers. Hate doing it. So hard. I'm going with Chris Zaldain 60%. I have to. He's got such a great track record here. 2 13th place finishes. Gosh, they eat a big swim bait at Fork, and in the time of the year, shad spawn, side fishing, anytime big fish are around, it seems like Zaldain connects, and he's in bucket E. That's tough going into the 5th event of the season.
No doubt.
At this point, classic spot on the line. If you win this event, I believe he's going to need to catch him, and I think he's going to show up.
Yeah, no doubt. I did not go percentage on that one.
Keep it going, Kyle.
So I did not go with Chris Zaldain and bucket E. Definitely kind of the same principle as the Keith Combs pick we were talking about earlier. Might be one that I look back on and say, holy cow, why did I not pick him? With that being said, bucket E, I went with Darold Gleason. So something that we also talked about a little bit in our Drain the Lake show was the fact that Darold Gleason is obviously extremely, extremely good on Toledo Bend, Sam Rayburn, those East Texas, Louisiana lakes. Having fished all those lakes, I feel like there's qualities. And something that you and I had talked about is, I remember talking to Derek Hudnall, who I think could also play in this event. And he was talking about some of the similarities between Toledo Bend and Fork. And there's a lot of things that fish the same way. And, I think there's enough similarities that he can take all of his knowledge from fishing Toledo Bend that time of the year and, make it work out on Fork. And let's be honest, I'm sure he's probably spent plenty of time on Fork as well. So I like Darold Gleason in bucket E. He's the second highest picked in the bucket at 9%, but that seems okay with me compared to 60.8. And like I said, that's something that you and I have talked about before, but like when we don't pick guys at high percentage, it's not necessarily that we don't think they're going to catch them or, we're like rooting against these guys or anything. I mean, I think Chris Zaldain being in bucket E, you would think probably would finish higher than a lot of these guys, especially on a lake that he's had so much success at a time of the year where, like we've talked about, big weights are going to play. I mean, you'd think a Chris Zaldain, regardless if he was in bucket A or bucket E, would be an outstanding pick. And like I said, I'm just going to play percentages on that one and go with Darold Gleason. Have a bounce back event at Lake Fork.
Yeah, and sorry for those watching on YouTube. I had to run and get my phone charger from my beautiful wife who brought it because, to be frank, we were at like 2% and it was about to end. And so I was trying to rush.
Oh, boy.
So we got it plugged in. But to take some more time, yeah, Darold Gleason, second highest person picked, you know, and Chris Zaldain being overwhelmingly, I mean, six times the percentage he is. And it's difficult to figure out why that is necessarily, and we'll get into that in our next little segment we're about to do. But I had to go with a high percentage guy like that. I mean, I think overall, my percentages are pretty solid. I've got a 10, a 5, a 5, a 4.5, and a 60. So it's very difficult, but no one spends more time on fork. No one spends more time on big baits, you know, things like that. I think a lot of time has been spent by Zaldain on fork over the last 3 years. And so he even spent some time with Livesey and attributed some knowledge of fork to Lee. Lee showed him the ropes a little bit of how these fish behave, because every Texas big bass factory just operates differently. And fork is one of those special and different places. So I think for a guy who has to swing, he's got to swing for a top 10. He's got to swing for a win possibly. And it's going to be a big fish beat down. It's hard not to pick him. So I'm justifying my 60%. And to be honest, I'll go down with the ship with 60% of the people. If he doesn't catch him, look at Bucket E and tell me another sure thing. Please do it. I'll wait. And I don't know if there's another sure thing. There's no sure things in bass fishing. But, man, a guy who knows the lake better than most, a guy who's set up for this fishing style, man, you could just pick a name out of the hat for Bucket E and really be able to have as good of a shot as an educated guess, because it is very difficult to predict. And so you got to ride with some experience there and some history and urgency. Urgency, I think, is a big one.
And let's be honest, this is something I think we just said a second ago, but if Chris Zaldain was in Bucket A, he would still be picked for this event, probably in the top 3 of Bucket A. I mean, so like you said, for him to be in Bucket E, it's just kind of a no-brainer. Hence the reason that 60% of people have picked him.
A little more hyperbole shows up when it's Bucket E and you're
right.
Fought for Angler of the Year and stuff over the last few years and had 5 second-place finishes one season, you know, something like that. So I agree. It's a little more hyperbole being in Bucket E, but I'm going to transition over to our welcome segment I dropped on you in the first one we did, hype or history, and I've got the 2 highest selected anglers in each bucket, and we're going to decipher if they're picked highly because of hype, which could be momentum from the past events, or people think that they should catch them good there when it might not even fit their style, or history, where they're coming off a history of great finishes or history on that specific lake or technique, whatever you want to justify it as. But some guys are hyped up and we wonder why. And then some guys have a great history and they are highly favored for a reason. So hyper history, we're going to go to bucket A and go back up to the top. Lee Livesey, hyped up or history, or Seth Feider. Lee's only at 18%. I mean, he spends 250 days a year on Lake Fork and he's 18%, but that's because he's in bucket A with the top 20 in Angler of the Year.
Yeah, I'm going to go history with Lee. I think you have to, just based on the statistic you just said. That's 100% the truth, and that would play in 1,000% no matter what you say if you were going to pick Lee Livesey, right? Seth Feider, I'm gonna go hype for sure.
Ooh,
I'm gonna go hype.
I'll touch you on that in a second, but go ahead.
So, I think a lot of people watched Bass Live there at Sabine. Seth, as always, had his swagger going, catch him on a spinnerbait. I mean, people are riding the hype on that one.
To get on the llama,
I think people are back on it. So that's why I'm going hype on Feider.
Well, I will say it could be hype. People want to see Seth Feider do well. They want to pick him because he's their fan favorite for anglers or for fans most of the time. But he does have some good history here. 11th in 2020 in the fall and 12th in 2019 in the spring. So he does have 2 great finishes, just outside the top 10 on both of those. We got to see him a little bit on Bass Live last year in the fall. And so he does have some good finishes there. Does it set up for Seth? I don't know. I do feel like he's getting to the point, like Greg Hackney, where most events set up for him. Like to be honest, I tweeted it and I got to find it. I got to go back and find it at some point. Let me do it. I'll search hashtag Ronnie Bass Stats. Or no, I didn't even do that. I'm going to go Ronnie Moore Bass on Twitter. And then I'm going to also type Seth Fighter because I tweeted about him earlier in the year with some great stats. And I think that, I said a low key. I tweeted it on February 23rd, 2021. There's your proof right there at the bottom of the screen. 3:25 p.m. I don't know what I was doing at 3:25 other than thinking about Seth Fighter. But I said low-key, quiet, but massive storyline from the St. John's. Seth Fighter finished third, his best Florida finish ever. Could he pull through and win AOY this year? Normally he starts off very behind the eight ball and has to catch up. His progression since 2015, his rookie year, 58th in points, 47th in points. Boom, he had some mojo going at the end of 2016 when he almost got kicked out, almost had to quit, had a second at the Mississippi River, had a first at Mille Lacs, and then he got 14th in AOY the next year, 18th, 5th, and then 12th last year. So since he really tried to gain his footing the first 2 years, he had so many boat problems the first year, second year, lack of funds and money, but really when it needed it most in his neck of the woods, Mississippi River out of La Crosse and Mille Lacs, he came through with a first and a second. And then from there, the confidence that has ensued, 14th, 18th, 5th, and 12th in AOY. And I said, it's amazing how some success can breed that. Now that he started off the season with a third, maybe he can keep that train going. And that was the first event of the year. And now we're through 4 events, and he is your Angler of the Year leader, I believe. And I had to check that. I had to corroborate that. But I think he's the Angler of the Year leader. And now we're almost halfway through the season. So Seth, a little bit of history there, but I think that he's starting to get in a comfort zone as an angler across the country.
Yeah, and and that would, to me, would go into hype category, just because of how good of a season he's having. I mean, typically, regardless the event, where it's at, who the current leader of AOY is, they typically have a fairly high percentage. Just because, I mean, if you want to ride with momentum, which is obviously a big factor in picking a fantasy fishing team, hard to beat against the guy that's leading the points. As far as hype goes.
Yeah, exactly. Next one, Bucket B, Brandon Kopp, Scott Martin. I feel like I know what this one's going to be, but I'm going to let you take it away.
It'll be a repeat of the Bucket A hyper history. So it'll be history and hype. So history being the fact that who could forget the history with Brandon Cobb at Fork. One of the most incredible days we've ever seen on Bassmaster Live ever. Was it 37 pounds or it was like upper 30s?
He had 37. He had I think he had 28 with 3 fish. He had an 8, an 8-13, and an 11-1.
Just like I will forever think of Lake Fork 2019 with him holding up an almost 9-pounder in one hand and an 11-pounder in the other hand, just showing them off like casually. Who does that? But
it's an event that's catchway release because of the giant slot from 16 to 24 inches that you have to throw back. That's why we have the catchway release for Lake Fork. Not any other reason. I promise you that. But for the catchway release for that 16 to 24 inch slot limit, no one culls because you're only bringing one end to weigh in. So that's a 24 plus incher that you could bring in and over. And he was culling. He culled an 8-8 with an 8-13, and then later he culls an 8-13 with an 11-1. And I'm like, in a tournament where culling is done on a score sheet, he's culling actually in the live well. And I was dumbfounded by it. And he would have had a shot at rivaling the all-time record weight if he didn't have 14 pounds on like day 2. He had 14 pounds on day 2. And what's crazy is on day 1 of that event, we Skyped with him for some bonus coverage you did, and he was chucking a big swim bait. And we were like, that's not something we expected to see him do. Never got another bite on it. Ended up throwing the jerk bait, and then he caught some sight fish, and then he caught some on a frog. incredible that day one he was on a big swim bait bite, was in contention. We saw him on day 2 struggle, and then the next week he was doing other stuff. So there's a lot of different techniques at play, but I like that history, of course. And then you say hype for Scott Martin, and I think it's pretty explanatory. But for all the Scott Martin YouTube lovers, don't kill Kyle. Let him explain.
Yeah, there's really no way to explain it without me sounding like a jerk. But I mean, obviously Scott Martin has such a following. Kind of the same thing as we've said with other guys. Regardless what bucket he's in, he's going to have a pretty high percentage. And I mean, having a good event there at the Sabine, and having a pretty good season to this point. Like you said, kind of waiting to see that breakthrough tournament, like you said, where he jumps into the top 10 on the final day. I think it's just kind of a matter of when, not if. But yeah, I mean, naturally, Scott Martin's going to have a lot of hype regardless where we're fishing. So let's just put it that way, I guess.
Hey, for sure. And he brings a great reputation, maybe not as much experience at Fork, but overall, historically, as an angler in the professional fishing world, he's definitely one to fear. Shallow is his game as well. I mean, he does a lot of things great, but fishing in Florida a lot. Sight fishing is probably something that he does a lot. Fishing some offshore little, whether it's grass or rock or something offshore at Okeechobee. You can translate that to something that's that mid-depth offshore for Fork, but it's not deep, kind of like what Rick Clunn was doing with a spinner bait and some of those other things, a crankbait last fall. So
I've thought for years that some of those Florida guys, they must be getting issued different pairs of sunglasses or something, because I mean, the ability for those guys to sight fish versus it really, for the most part, most anybody else on tour, statistically, those guys from Florida are so good at sight fishing, which would play into the fact that stylistically this would also set up well for him. So there's hype, but at the same point, like, it's reasonable. It's definitely reasonable.
Oh yeah, and it's just reps. It's just reps. If you're a quarterback and you throw the ball 6 times like Navy does in a season, you're not going to be great at throwing the ball. You're going to have a chance to mess up. A lot of these anglers don't sight fish at all, and they only do it in elite tournaments, and they try to stay away from it. Fishermen in Florida always are doing it. I think I caught more fish in the 2013 regional at Lake Norman for the college series, my home lake. I caught more fish on that clear fishery off the bed than I've caught in Arkansas in my 4 years here, because you just don't see them that frequently. Like it happens so quick, or because Arkansas is fantastic at raising and lowering the water for no reason in the middle of spawn. Sometimes they spawn so deep you don't see them. So repetition for Florida anglers, they just get accustomed to seeing them more.
Yeah, I think that's a huge factor. And you saying that, being a guy that now lives in Alabama, but obviously grew up my entire life fishing in Arkansas, that's just true. There's a lot of places that set up really well to sight fish.
Yeah.
Not many of them are in Arkansas.
Yeah. Exactly.
Just because, I mean, you can go up to North Arkansas, like some of the White River lakes, they're clear enough to see them. But yeah, some of those fish spawn so deep that you can't see them anyways. So, like I said, it's
every February I will go in a pocket and see a bush and says, I can't wait to catch one off the bed over there in April, May. I'll never even see one there ever. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like you said, with guys in Florida, I think that's just a thing. Just do it more than anybody else.
So bucket C, hyper history. I feel like these are pretty chalk hyper histories. I think I'm going to guess, my mental guesses on what you're going to pick have been spot on so far, and I'm expecting it to continue. But hyper history, Mr. Lake Fort Keith Combs.
Yeah, history.
Here, Clark Windley.
History for Combs. I mean, that's a no-brainer. Historically, one of the the best fishermen on Lake Fork ever. Also, I think one of the most amazing statistics ever in any sort of bass fishing, professional bass fishing tournament, is the 3-day event that TTBC or whatever it was back then, where he caught 130 some odd pounds. And is that not true? It was 100. It was over 100.
I think it was 115.
Okay, well, whatever. That I overshot it by at least 40. I overshot it by at least 2 fish. Well, I mean, 115 or what? It was well over 100. Let's just put it that way. In 3 days. I mean, it doesn't take a mathematician to do the math in your head on that, what it would take a day. Granted, not the same time of the year, definitely not the same style of fishing, but that's
God, if someone's gonna find them offshore at Fork,
completely sidetracked, but I just think that's one of the things.
sorry, you're say that again. What were you saying about your service kind of chopped up?
I was just saying that's just one of the most incredible things ever. So it just needs to be said.
Oh, for sure. And it's scary with the 41%, and we're saying we're going to get burned by it, because if there's one angler to find an offshore school of fish that were spawned out a month ago and moved out there, that now they're 6-pounders, Keith Combs is going to be the one that find them. I mean, he's going to drop his trolling motor down in practice and be like, nope, I don't need to drop my trolling motor. I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to idle and I'm going to idle and I'm going to idle until I find 2 schools that I need. And then he's going to fire them up at some point in the day. So we've seen it every single time there. So yeah, history 100%, which so much history kind of translates into hype. And,
Sure.
and he needs to produce now, but it is all stemming from history.
No doubt. Another thing to add on that, like another thing is you look at most all of his history on Fork, obviously being offshore, cranking, fishing schools of fish. It's not like he's going to be lost if he has to go fish shallow either. So, I think either way it turns out, but like you said, most likely to find fish offshore to catch, even in this event. Windlet. I mean, history in the sense that he's inevitably fished Lake Fork plenty, I'm sure, being a Texan. But I feel like, with that being said, it would be a hype thing for this tournament just based on the fact he's the reigning AOY leader. He's in Bucket C. That's not even, we're not used to seeing Windlet in Bucket C as it is.
Just had a great 30th place at the Sabine or so and moved up D into C.
Right. So I'm going to say hype. And it's also one of those things, there might not be any concrete evidence, but his name on Bassmaster Fishing does say Texas at the end of it. So, he's got to be a good pick.
He does have a TV show as well called Fishing and Hunting Texas. So I think he's made his rounds, especially like.
Yeah, and I say all that joking because of the fact that some events, it just seems like whatever the home state guy is might have never even fished there. But not the case with Clark Windlet. I'm sure he spent as much time as, definitely more time than 85% of the field, 90% of the field. So I'll say hype. But as far as like concrete Bassmaster events there, I'm gonna say hype.
Talley and Pipkin. Speaking of a guy from Texas, Frank Talley, and speaking of a guy who's done well at Fort before, Chad Pipkins, Bucket D.
So I'm going to say, I'm also going to have one hype, one history. We're going to flip-flop them. So Talley with the hype, and then Pipkins with the history. Once again, that 2019 tournament, who could forget the new personal best and, the things that transpired in that tournament. Obviously, an outstanding tournament for Chad. I think he'll do well there. He's done well there both times, in 2020 and 2019. So, like I said, at that point, when you look at it that way, it's like you've got to have a pretty good feel for the lake to be able to catch them in 2 completely different times.
And not necessarily. He's not from there. He's from Michigan. He picked up a crankbait that's probably never been thrown there, caught him on it, and it's his comfort crankbait. And so if there's a guy that maybe – also, he's a great drop shotter, and I will agree with you on that if they end up being on bed and maybe it's Lake Fork, they're not ever not pressured. Like I just didn't.
Right.
They're always pressured. So if there's a bedfish that's been looked at a couple times or maybe 100, a drop shot might catch it, and some Texans probably ain't picking that up necessarily.
Yeah, no kidding. That's actually really true. That's something that has not been stated, but I think really should be more about this tournament. It'll you guys will definitely talk about it on live, I'm sure, but
for sure.
Lake Fork in April, there's no way that there's a lake in the country that gets more pressure. Lake Gunnersville, maybe, as you got to see firsthand this year, maybe, but as far as per size of the lake, there's no way.
Oh yeah.
So that's definitely got to factor in too. That's actually something, like I said, that's something when I talked to Keith Combs at Palatka, we shot a Toyota bonus bucks thing with him, and we were just chatting and talking about this tournament. And that's what he's more worried about than anything. It's just how pressured those fish will be, given the time period. Like you said, there might be a lot of fish on beds, but they might have been messed with quite a bit before these guys get to actually fish for them on tournament day.
So I would agree with that. And last two buckets, or the last bucket, last two anglers, hyper history. Two, I wouldn't say Texans. Both aren't from Texas. Gleason lives in Louisiana, right across the border, and Zaldain lives in Texas, but is a transplant from the West Coast, but makes his home there and has for the last, half decade. And so Zaldain 60%, Gleason 10%. Which one's hype? Which one's history? Or are both either?
So we about last show is the fact that if you're in, it's kind of hard to be hype in a way, because it's, especially at this point of the season, it's not like it's been going well. And that's not, that's not a hate at anybody, but that's just reality. It's a tough season to this point if you're in Bucket E. With that being said, it's got to be history for both those guys. I mean, for Zaldain, no doubt, has had tremendous history there. Like we said earlier, it doesn't matter if he was in Bucket A, he would also be that highly percentage picked. But also, I would say history, not necessarily in tournament evidence to look back on Gleason, but history in the sense that not living too far away from there, you'd think he's fished there quite a bit. History in that way, I guess. So, because obviously didn't have a great event at the Speen. Had a few tough tournaments in a row. So, I mean, it'd be hard to say hype in that regard. I mean, maybe hype in like fishing style, which I think you could definitely argue, but I would say I'd say history, I guess. It'd be hard to pick either of those, actually.
Yeah. Zaldain's good history and the types of baits that factor give it a lot of hype, for sure.
No doubt. Sure.
Well, we discussed that a couple minutes ago, so I'm not going to beat that horse again. But yeah, so there's our fantasy fishing picks for Rapala Bassmaster Fantasy Fishing. Our 5 buckets, an angler per bucket, the OG version of fantasy fishing. If you're wondering about mercury drain the lake, we did a video on that. Our last YouTube video went up on this channel about that. We displayed our picks. I actually have it time coded out, the different topics and things that we discussed within that episode. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, this is episode 28 of Cast a Podcast. Appreciate Kyle joining us, and we are going to sign off with one last thing. I want to know what the winning weight is, what your fantasy tiebreaker is, what you think is the winning weight of the event. 4 days in late April at Lake Fork. I've got mine selected, but pounds and ounces, what's it going to take to win this event?
Okay, so when I say this, I wouldn't suggest other people listen to what I'm saying as far as the tiebreaker goes, but I'm going with reverse psychology in the fact that if I say it's going to take less than 100 pounds, it'll take over 100 pounds. So I'm
doing it for the pleasure, the viewing.
Yes, for the entertainment. Yeah, I'm doing everybody a favor here. This is not for fantasy fishing points. I'm just trying to do everybody a favor that's going to get to see over 100 pounds, crossing your fingers, because I'm taking one for the team. But with that being said, right now I have 98.8. It's going to take just under 100. Do I think it'll take 100 plus? I think the odds are really, really good. But like I said, I'm throwing some reverse psychology in there to get to 100 pounds.
Well, I'm gonna go complete opposite of you then. If you're doing it low to hope it makes 100, man, they're gonna catch 54 pounds for 4 days right here with mine, because I selected 121 pounds 2 ounces, and I felt like I was a little high because we haven't seen one that high in a long time. To be honest, we hadn't seen the Century Club get broken since 2013 at Falcon. We do it at Fork in 2019, 114 pounds for Brandon Cobb. Garrett Paquette had 101.15, so we had 2 anglers make it. Last year, basically, It wasn't supposed to happen. Second place was 75 pounds, but Patrick Walters wins by 28, 29 pounds, has 104, and breaks the century mark. So can we go 3 for 3 on Lake Fork breaking the century mark? I think so. I posed that question to Stetson Blaylock at dinner the other night because, of course, fishermen and fishing people can't not talk about that at dinner. So I said, what do you think it's going to take? And he said, man, I think 120. And I was like, oh, good, because I said 121. I thought I was nuts. And so he thinks 120. He thought maybe 5 anglers would break the century mark as well. So I'd expect the fish to be biting. I'd expect a lot of people that may not know bass fishing, which we don't, as much as you know it, you can get fooled by your thoughts and your wants more than what's happening. But man, a couple cold fronts. What are these couple cold days going to do? Because it's in the low 40s for the lows in the evenings, and then it's in the 60s, for the highs over the next couple of days. And it's the same way in Arkansas. They're so far into the spawn, whether fish are pulling up on the bed this week or not, the water temperature has been what it's been, and it's stayed consistent. So those fish are on the move because of the biological clock in their brains, not because of what the weather's done the last week. So I think they're on the move. Nothing's going to tell them different. 40 degrees or so ain't going to hurt them. And I think that it could open up some other things. It could either set back the shad spawn to where it all busts out across the lake at the same time, or it's going to prolong maybe a topwater bite where those fish might go and head offshore quicker. They might stay up there a little bit longer and hang out because it's a comfortable temperature. It's not as soon as the spawn happens and then boom, water temp 75, 80 degrees, and they need to, they get a little relief deeper. But I think 121 is my weight. I want to see it be that high. We haven't seen one that high in a while. And, man, I think my fantasy team, we've got a couple anglers that can do it. A Scott Canterbury, a Greg Hackney, a Chris Zaldain. I think we could have I might have 5 anglers make the top 10. I'm just saying.
Well, we'll see about it. I think it's possible. I certainly think that's possible, but statistically speaking, I don't like your chances.
Well, hey, Brandon Polinick shoots for 9 Elite Series wins every season, and he probably won't ever do it, but that's not going to make him change his mind. So Ronnie Moore's going to think, I'm going to get all 5 in the top 10. And if I do, I'm going to be really missing out on all the gift cards and prize packages because I can't win a dang thing from Bassmaster, but maybe I'll win some Tackle Warehouse or some other stuff. So that'll be good. But that's episode 28. We're done. I thought it was going to be 20, 30 minutes, but we can't do one that short. We're
not possible.
50-something minutes again, an hour, but it's great. It's fun. If you haven't set your Drain the Lake team, do that. 8 anglers, no buckets. Once you pick that angler for the event, you can't pick them going forward the rest of the season. So who you pick at Fork, you can't use at Neely. You won't be able to use it at Gunnersville, the Classic, and the Northern Swing. They're done. So a little bit of strategy there. It's kind of like the NFL Eliminator Survivor Pool Challenge where, you lose a team. You predict them to win. If they win, you're good, but you can't use them again. Otherwise, we would just pick the Kansas City Chiefs every single event probably or every single week. But new game mode, that's fun. Or if you only want to stick to the OG version, Rapala Bassmaster Fantasy Fishing, it's a good odds that your picks will translate there as well. So that's episode 28, Cast a Podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, appreciate you hanging out with an hour for us. Drop some comments below of what you'd like us to cover and some other ones. We're going to recap each event and preview with fantasy fishing aspects involved and more. So we're excited to bring that, and we appreciate you, Kyle. But for us, we're done. Peace out.